It was a gloomy morning. Heavy gray clouds stretched across the sky, pressing on the roofs of the houses as if to herald a storm. The narrow streets of the city, framed by shabby facades, were almost empty. Only a few passers-by, slouching in the penetrating wind, hurried to hide in the nearest doorways, leaving the street immersed in an ominous silence. Martha walked slowly, leaning on her cane. Her tired face, mottled with deep wrinkles, betrayed years of struggle. She was used to being alone. Life in this neighborhood was never easy, especially for an elderly black woman. Every step was a heavy reminder that she was not welcome in this place, in this time. Her dog, a large German shepherd with faded fur and a wary look, moved beside her like a shadow. Martha had rescued him 2 years ago when he'd been written off from the police force because of an injury. No one wanted a dog like that, but Martha saw something special in him. They had become family to each other, and now he was her only protector in a world that had long ago turned its back on her. The city looked empty, but it was a deceptive sensation. Martha knew it breathed anger. Storefronts with boarded-up windows, scraps of newspaper hanging in the air, and graffiti spewing hate all reminded her that fear and prejudice ruled here. She could feel the stares on her, invisible but searing. Every step filled her with a vague anxiety. The dog suddenly froze, its ears perked up, its eyes stared forward, and its withers stood up. Martha froze, her heart thudding. She knew her dog was rarely wrong. Something was ahead, something bad. Muffled voices sounded in the distance. They came closer and closer. The laughter, loud, harsh, barbed, echoed off the walls. Martha froze in place, instinctively gripping her cane tighter. Her faithful friend tensed, as if preparing for an attack. She had seen them before. These young men with eyes full of malice walked in groups, leaving a trail of humiliation and fear behind them. Today, they had chosen her. But neither they nor Martha herself knew yet that this time the victim was not so defenseless. The men's footsteps grew louder and louder. The sound of heavy boots on the sidewalk, interspersed with rough laughter, seemed to grow like the roar of an approaching thunderstorm. Martha felt an icy lump of fear clench in her stomach, but not a muscle in her face quivered. She'd learned to hide her feelings. Life had forced her to. "Hey, Grandma," came a voice that cut through the silence like a knife. A man in his 30s with a short-cropped head stood just ahead of him, with 3 others behind him. They all wore leather jackets and jeans that looked like uniforms, a symbol of strength and unity in their hatred. "Are you lost out here or something? Is anyone in this neighborhood happy to see you?" His words caused another burst of rude laughter. One of his buddies, a tall guy with a tattoo stretching from neck to ear, stepped forward and grinned wickedly. Yeah. This place isn't for people like you. I'm surprised you're still alive. Maybe someone told you it was safe. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it's not true." Martha felt the dog tense beside her. His low growl, almost inaudible, made her glance downward. The sheepdog kept his gaze on the men, and his tense stance made it clear that he was ready to act. "Look at that," smirked the third of the group, a full-bodied guy with a face disfigured by an old scar. "She's got a guard." "Big dog, but we've seen them before. You'd better get him out of here, Grandma, before something unpleasant." The words, full of venom, crawled through the air like snakes. The men began to approach, their circle around Martha growing tighter and tighter. She could feel her breathing getting heavier and heavier, but she held herself upright. She knew that weakness would only encourage them. "It's not just a grandmother, it's a problem," said the fourth, the youngest of them. His eyes burned with hatred. "You know, people like you should have been kicked out of here a long time ago. You always think you can live here, work here, walk these streets like you're not dirt underfoot." The words came down on Martha like an icy downpour. Words she'd heard all her life, but they didn't make them any less painful. The threats grew louder and louder. One of the men suddenly struck her cane, knocking it out of her hands. She staggered, but steadied herself, leaning on her faithful dog. "What, Grandma?" the first one asked sneeringly. "Now, who's going to help you? A dog? Will it scare us? Go ahead, call the police, or better yet, pray we change our minds." "I don't think so." The men, enraged by their own brutality, began to push even harder. One of them grabbed Martha by the sleeve of her coat, yanking her roughly toward him. But before he could do anything else, there was a sharp, menacing sound. A growl. It was deep, like thunder, filled with fury. Martha's dog was no longer just a dog. His instincts, his past that seemed long forgotten, flared up in an instant. He stood between the woman and her tormentors, his teeth bared and his eyes glowing with ruthless determination. The men froze. It was the first warning, but none of them yet realized what they were facing. "Did you hear that? It's growling," the scarred man shouted angrily, stepping forward. "Come on, show me what you can do, doggy, or are you as useless as your mistress?" The men burst into laughter that was both loud and icy. One of them kicked the cane that lay on the ground so that it flew far away. Martha was silent, her hands trembling, but she clenched her fists, trying to hold on. The dog stood in front of her as before, tensing every muscle. "Your dog won't save you," continued the main one, the one with the short haircut. His voice was soaked with hatred. "People like you shouldn't be here. We're doing you a favor. Maybe after this you'll realize where you belong." With these words, he yanked the woman by the collar of her coat. Martha staggered, her legs buckled, and she fell to her knees. The dog instantly rushed to him, but another of the men kicked the animal. The blow was hard, and the dog flew backward, but rose at once, growling with more fury. "Look," the third of them snorted. "The grandmother can't get up. Are you old? Are you done? Or do you think you deserve something better? You've spent your whole life only using other people's labor. Don't you think we know that?" They surrounded her in a tight ring, their voices growing louder and their words dirtier. One of the men grabbed Martha by the shoulder, lifted her up, and pushed her back to the ground. Dust rose into the air, settling on her coat, hair, and face. She heard her cane crunch under someone's foot. Despair flared in the woman's soul, but there was nothing she could do. "You have no business being here at all, you understand?" growled the tall man with the tattoo. "This neighborhood is not for people like you. You're dirt. You're all dirt. And if you think you can just walk around here and pretend you're one of us, you're wrong." He grabbed the handkerchief she was using to cover her head and tore it off, exposing her gray hair. This provoked another burst of laughter. One of them spat on the ground beside her, showing his contempt. "Look at her," said the youngest. His eyes burned with malevolence. "You think your dog will stand up for you? She can't even stand up for herself. Do you want to see her run away screaming?" He swung at the dog again, but at that moment the sheepdog jumped. Its powerful jaws closed on the man's arm and there was a wild scream. The others recoiled, but quickly recovered. One of them grabbed a splintered board lying nearby and struck the dog on the back. The dog howled, but did not let go of its prey. Martha tried to rise, but her strength was failing her. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breathing ragged. Her world had narrowed to one question. would she survive today? You and your dog will remember us for a long time, one of the men growled, lifting her off the ground by the collar. His eyes burned with the lust for the pain he wanted to inflict. But none of them knew yet that this time they had gone too far. Her name was Raina, which means queen in Spanish, and she was indeed a queen on her own battlefield. Before her fate had crossed with Martina, Raina had been an elite police dog, trained for the most difficult operations. Her eyes shone with intelligence, and her body had a power and swiftness that made her indispensable in her work. Raina was recruited as a puppy. She went through a rigorous training course, detecting explosives, catching criminals, protecting her partner. Her life was timed to the minute, every action honed to the point of automaticity. She was trained to be a weapon, precise, ruthless, but absolutely controlled. She could recognize a threat faster than a human. Her reaction was lightning fast. Flashes of the past flashed through her mind. She remembered the smells of fear and adrenaline on the streets where she'd walked side by side with the cops. She remembered the screams of the criminals she caught up with, the sharp commands on which her partner's life depended. But the most important thing she remembered was duty. To protect, to serve, never back down. However, Raina's career ended abruptly. During one of her operations, she was seriously wounded. While chasing an armed criminal, she came under fire. The bullet missed her, but left a deep mark. After that, she was declared unfit for duty. She was no longer useful to the system she'd worked in all her life. She was transferred to a shelter for decommissioned service dogs. Many of her kin stayed there for the rest of their lives. But Raina was lucky. Martha, a lonely woman with a kind heart, saw something in this dog that others missed. She took her home, giving her a second chance. Life with Martha was quiet. Raina had become her protector, her faithful companion, but the old instincts were still there. She stayed alert, her keen nose picking up every change in the air, her muscles remembering movements honed by years of training. And now, on this filthy street, surrounded by danger, Raina felt her duty returned again. Her eyes burned with the same fire that neither time nor pain could extinguish. Each of the attacking men was a threat to her that needed to be eliminated. Her brain worked faster than a human's, analyzing, selecting a target, assessing weaknesses. She remembered how to lunge at an armed man, how to knock him down, how to hold him down until help arrived. She remembered how to protect her partner, even if it required risking her own life. She was ready to do it again. When the man with the broken board swung at her again, Raina instinctively shifted to the side, dodging the blow. Her leap was precise, calculated. Her teeth closed on his forearm with such force that he cried out in pain. She knew how to weaken an opponent, how to make him let go of his weapon, how to render him incapable of further attack. The other men hesitated. Their laughter and mockery were replaced by shouts and confusion. They had not expected that the dog, who had seemed a mere companion to the old woman, would turn out to be a deadly machine ready to destroy them. But Raina kept her main goal in mind. Her job was not to hurt, but to protect her mistress. Her well-practiced actions and incredible determination could change everything. The men did not yet realize that they were engaged in a battle they had already lost. The scream of the man whose hand was clenched in Raina's powerful jaws echoed through the narrow street. He tried to break free, but the dog held him like an iron trap. Her eyes, burning with fury, met his, and in them he saw not just an animal, but an experienced fighter who knew no fear. "Get her off!" He shouted and swung his other hand, but Raina only tightened her grip. Her teeth penetrated deeper, and blood spurted onto the dirty sidewalk. The other men froze, their self-confidence and arrogance evaporating in an instant. None of them had expected such power from a dog that was supposed to be the old woman's harmless companion. "This thing is sick," the other shouted, picking up a splintered board. But before he could swing, Raina, having released her first victim, came at him with incredible speed. She leaped, knocking him to the ground, and her teeth found their target, his shoulder. The man collapsed to the ground, and his scream mingled with wheezes of pain. "She'll tear us apart," the third shouted fearfully, backing away. But Raina didn't give them a second's respite. Her movements were precise, each one honed. She attacked not for aggression, but to disarm. Her training flared brightly, and her every jump, bite, growl was part of an instinctive plan. Martha, lying on the ground, raised her head. She looked at her dog in amazement. Her Raina, her quiet, kind companion, had turned into a fierce protector. The woman felt mixed emotions, fear for her friend, pride, and a strange relief. She knew. At this moment, the dog was her only hope. The gang leader grabbed a metal bar lying nearby. His face was red with anger and fear. He swung, aiming for the dog's head, but Raina, as if anticipating his move, turned sharply. She let go of her previous target and tore straight toward him. A second, and he was slammed to the ground. The metal bar fell out of his hands with a thud. The sheepdog stood over him, pinning his shoulders to the ground with her powerful paws. Her teeth were centimeters from his throat. All right, put it away," he shrieked, losing confidence for the first time in his life. "We're leaving, do you hear me? Just put it away." Raina growled, her loud sound causing the men to freeze. The other two, realizing that the odds were not on their side, backed away. Their smug faces were replaced by confusion and panic. They were in shock. Their gangs were feared in this neighborhood, and now they themselves were on the brink of destruction. "Go away," Martha's hoarse voice rang out. She rose, leaning on her knees. There was no more fear in her eyes, only icy hardness. "Now, before she kills you." The men, without waiting for a second invitation, rushed out, supporting their wounded comrades. Their shouts faded into the distance, leaving the street empty and ominous. But Raina still stood motionless, watching their receding silhouettes. Her body tensed, her breathing heavy. She didn't retreat until she was sure the danger was over. When everything was quiet, Raina turned back to Martha. Her gaze, which had just been filled with rage, was calm again. She gently rubbed her nose into her palm as if asking, "Are you all right?" Martha, with trembling arms, put her arms around her neck. Tears glistened in her eyes. "Thank you, girl. You saved me," she whispered. But deep down, Martha realized this wasn't just a victory. It was a war that had just begun. The street had fallen into a deafening silence again. Only Martha's heavy breathing and Raina's muffled growls disturbed it. The woman crouched on the edge of the sidewalk, her body trembling from the horror of the experience. She wrapped her arms around her head, trying to come to her senses. But Raina, though she stayed close by, did not sit still. She continued to stare off into the distance, to where the attackers had hidden. Fury still burned in her heart. It wasn't just defensive behavior, it was an instinct that had once been her duty. She felt the job wasn't finished. Martha was safe, but these men were still a threat. They weren't gone forever. They could come back, and Raina couldn't let that happen. Her ears twitched sharply as she caught distant sounds, running footsteps, muffled voices. The sheepdog rose like a warrior ready for battle. She took a few steps forward, surveying the street, and finally made her way to where the attackers had hidden. Martha looked at her anxiously. "Raina!" "No!" she exclaimed, but the dog did not stop. Her instincts, her training, drove her forward. The attackers, limping and supporting each other, made their way to an abandoned warehouse a few blocks away. They thought they had found shelter, a place where they could lick their wounds and discuss what had happened. The room smelled damp and decaying. The windows were boarded up, and light barely shone through the gaps in the walls. "What the hell kind of dog was that?" one of them hissed, massaging his bleeding hand. "I've never seen such a beast before." "Police dog," the ringleader said through gritted teeth, still clutching his chest, trying to catch his breath. She could see it in her eyes. The bitch knew what she was doing, but I'll remember that for her, and Grandma too. "Shut up," said the other. "We need to figure out what to do. If someone saw us, then you know how that ends." Their voices sounded louder in the deafening silence of the warehouse. They didn't notice a silent shadow slip through the open crack in the door. Raina was here. She moved silently, her every move precise. Her trained sense of smell led her straight to her target. She knew how to track odors, how to detect the tiniest sign of an enemy's presence. The scent of their blood and fear led her like a guiding star. She entered the room and lurked in the corner, her eyes flickering in the dim light. The men continued to argue, unaware of the threat that surrounded them. Raina moved along the wall, her steps soft, like a predator waiting for the moment to attack. She knew there was no need to rush. She would choose the moment to strike. The first of them noticed her too late. Raina lunged forward, her strong paws silently covering the distance to the nearest of the men. She knocked him to the ground, sinking her teeth into his leg. His scream tore through the air, and the others jumped up, grabbing at the first thing that could be a weapon. "She's here," screamed one of them. "That thing found us." Raina gave them no time to prepare. She let go of the first and switched to the second with lightning speed, sinking her teeth into the hand with which he swung the iron pipe at her. He collapsed, his scream drowned out by the rumble of falling metal. She knew how to disarm. Her grip was designed to incapacitate, but not kill. She remembered her training, where she'd been taught to attack in such a way that the victim couldn't fight back. The ringleader, gathering the rest of her strength, pulled out a knife and lunged at her. But Raina was faster. She dodged, her sharp fangs finding his wrist. The knife fell out of his hand, and he collapsed to his knees, his face twisted in pain. "Leave us alone," he shouted, his voice pleading for the first time. "We're leaving. We won't touch her again." Raina didn't answer. She only continued to growl as she stood over him, her gaze filled with determination. The others didn't try to resist anymore. They huddled in corners like pathetic rats, realizing their powerlessness. This dog had turned them from predators to prey. When it was over, Raina slowly backed away. She didn't kill. She only made it clear that the game was over for them. Her duty was done. She returned to Martha, finding her on the same street where she had left her. The woman was sitting on the curb, staring anxiously into the distance. When Raina approached, Martha looked up. Her face showed relief and gratitude. "You're back," she whispered, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. "Thank you, girl. Thank you." Raina licked her hand as if to say, "I'm always here." But there was a quiet fire burning in her eyes. She knew the threat could return, and she was ready to stand up for it again if need be. The silence in the warehouse was deafening. It pressed the attackers, who now looked more like frightened children than fearsome predators. Their self-confidence crumbled like dust blown away by the wind. Raina stood in the middle of the room like a ghost, her breathing heavy but even, her eyes watching their every move. The leader, clutching his bleeding hand, tried to rise, his face contorted in pain, but he still clung to the remnants of his arrogance. "It's just a dog," he wheezed, turning to his companions. "We can't let it—" He didn't finish. Raina growled, low, muffled, warning. He froze like a hunted animal, sensing that any careless movement could be his last. The other attackers were not so bold. One of them, a tall man with a scar, was cradling his bloody shoulder, his eyes darting from Raina to the door as if he were searching for a way to escape. But he realized that if he tried to run, the dog would get him before he made a move. His body shook with fear. "What now?" he muttered in a shaky voice, turning to the leader. "We're trapped. She'll finish us off. I don't want to die because of your ambition." The ringleader turned to him, anger flashing in his eyes. "Shut up. We can handle it. It's just a beast." "It's not a beast." The other man, the one Raina had knocked down, interrupted him. He sat leaning against the wall, his face dead pale. "It's a car. A police dog. You've seen how it works. It counted us all in a minute." Raina didn't move. Her body remained tense and her gaze remained focused. She waited. Her instincts told her that her attackers hadn't given up yet. They were biding their time, looking for a loophole, and she was ready to stop it. In her mind, this was a training exercise, as it had been dozens of times before. Her job was to neutralize the threat, but not give the enemy a chance to rise again. The leader rose, limping, and waddled with difficulty to the table where the tools were lying. His fingers fumbled for something heavy, a small hammer. He turned to his companions, his voice louder and angrier. "If we team up, she'll never make it. We corner her, take whatever we can get our hands on, and end this thing. This is our chance." He turned to Raina, a faint spark of hope in his eyes. He stepped forward, raising the hammer. But Raina didn't give him time to act. She rushed forward with such speed that the others didn't even have time to react. Her jump was precise and calculated. She knocked the hammer from his hand, simultaneously causing him to collapse to his knees. Her teeth closed on his wrist and he howled in pain. "Get out!" he shouted, but there was no confidence in his voice. "We surrender. Do you hear? We surrender." The others, seeing him fall, realized that the battle was lost. One of them clenched his teeth in pain and raised his hands in the air, as if in surrender. The other, who had been sitting in the corner, struggled to his feet and glanced at the door. "We're not going back," he wheezed, trying to keep his voice calm. "Let her let us go. We're leaving." But Raina was in no hurry to let go of the ringleader. She kept him on the ground, showing him who was boss. Her growl grew louder, warning that even the slightest attempt at resistance would bring further consequences. Her gaze seemed to say, "This is my lesson, and you will remember it." When the men finally emerged from the building, staggering and supporting each other, they no longer looked like predators. Their arrogance was gone. Only humiliation and fear remained. They realized their strength was nothing against what they faced. This dog had not only protected his mistress, but had shattered their confidence, putting them in their place. Away from the warehouse, in the darkness of the streets, one of them, limping, stopped and looked back. "We're not going back there," he muttered, "and we'll never touch it again. It's not worth it." The leader, gritting his teeth in pain, only nodded silently. He did not look back again. He didn't want to remember the dog that had made them flee. By the time Raina returned to Martha's house, night had fallen on the city, pulling it into darkness. A light wind stirred the fallen leaves, lifting them into the air like dancing ghosts. Martha sat on the cold sidewalk, her eyes staring into the distance where her faithful dog had disappeared. Her heart clenched with anxiety, but deep down she knew that Raina would not leave her, would not disappear forever. The heavy footsteps of an approaching dog snapped Martha out of her musings. Raina appeared in the circle of the dim streetlight, her strong body still tense, but her eyes were no longer furious. They were filled with something else, fatigue and quiet pride. She approached Martha, paused for a moment, as if waiting for her mistress to be the first to break the silence. "You're back," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. She held out her hand, and Raina slowly rubbed her nose in her palm. The movement, simple but full of meaning, was like saying, "I'm here. I'll always be here for you." Martha wrapped her arms around her, pulling her close, her fingers sinking into the dog's thick fur. The tears she'd been holding back all this time ran down her cheeks, but they weren't just tears of fear or relief. They were tears of gratitude and love. Raina hadn't just saved her. She'd proven that loyalty and protection weren't just instincts, but a conscious choice she'd made for her mistress. "You're my hero," Martha whispered, snuggling against the dog. "You have no idea how much I need you." Raina growled softly, but it wasn't a warning. It was almost a soothing sound, as if she too was trying to comfort her mistress. Her body, which had just been a weapon, was now a source of warmth and strength. She remained at the ready, but her primary mission was accomplished. Her mistress was safe. Martha stood up, leaning on a cane she had found nearby. Her legs trembled, but she held herself upright. Raina walked beside her with a steady stride, her strong figure inspiring confidence. Together they walked home, leaving the nightmare behind them. When they reached their small house, Martha's first order of business was to check her protector's wounds. Raina sat still, letting her mistress treat the scratches and bruises she had received in the battle. The woman whispered words of thanks to her as if she were praying. "You deserve the best, Raina. You deserve the whole world," she said, stroking her behind her ear. "I don't know how I survived without you." Raina looked at her, and there was something in her gaze that Martha had always noticed. Intelligence. She understood every word. She didn't demand gratitude, didn't expect a reward. She did it because Martha was her family, her friend, her meaning. The next morning, as light flooded the streets, news of the incident began to spread. Neighbors who had heard about the attack wondered how the elderly woman and her dog had managed to cope with a gang of known hooligans. People began to look at Martha and her faithful companion with respect and even admiration. Raina became a symbol of justice. Her name was whispered from house to house, and those who had previously been afraid to go outside suddenly felt more confident. She showed that even in a world filled with evil and injustice, there is always room for strength and goodness. For Martha, Raina was more than just a dog. She was her savior, her friend, and a reminder that true loyalty could overcome any hardship. And that night, when danger loomed over them both, she proved that loyalty isn't just a word. It's an action. It's life. The morning sun rose slowly over the city, casting its dim streets in a golden light. But this morning did not carry the usual peace. The residents of the neighborhood, who were used to living in the shadow of threats and injustice, woke up to news that spread like wildfire. The story of an elderly woman, her faithful dog, and her nightly battle against a group of bullies became a topic of conversation on every corner. A small crowd had gathered in the main street. Among them were those who had witnessed the attack or heard the screams but dared not intervene. People looked at the signs of the night's struggle: torn sheets from the boards of the warehouse, blood dried in stains on the sidewalk, and deep scratches on the asphalt left by the claws of a dog. This place became a mute testimony to events that shook everyone to the core. "Did you see that?" a woman with gray hair asked, turning to her neighbor. Her voice trembled with excitement. "I heard those guys screaming like they'd met the devil himself." "It wasn't just any dog," added the man in the jacket standing next to him. His face remained tense. "They deserved what they got. Those bastards kept us in fear for a long time. But to be chased down by one dog? That's unbelievable." Some were otherwise inclined. A young girl who stood a little to the side was talking in a low voice to her friend. "It's dangerous. What if that dog comes after us? It tore them up. Did you see what they did to her owner? She could have attacked anyone." But her friend shook her head, defending Raina. "Would she? Do you really think she did it for nothing? She was protecting her mistress. None of us would dare say a word against those bastards, and this dog did something we can't do." In the evening, when most of the news subsided, this case only gained momentum. People shared their versions of events, relaying them to each other with speculation and emotion. Some claimed to have seen Raina knock the ringleader to the ground with one jump, then hold him down while he begged for mercy. Others said the dog seemed to read the men's minds, attacking each at the most unexpected moment. In a nearby cafe, several elderly men were gathered at a corner table. They were discussing Martha, their old acquaintance who never complained and always held her dignity despite her hardships. "I knew she was strong," one of them said, sipping his coffee. "But who would have thought her dog would be a hero? It's a police dog. You can tell she's trained. They don't back down." "Yeah, but did you hear what those guys were saying?" The other one interrupted him, lowering his voice. "They're afraid to come back here. Those scumbags we were afraid of are now victims themselves. You think they're just going to walk away?" The old man was silent for a moment, nodding. "They will. They won't show their faces for a long time after this lesson." The next day, the first visitors showed up at the door of Marta's house. Neighbors carried baskets of food, treats, and even toys for Raina. Many of them had never spoken to the woman before. Some had shunned her, others simply didn't notice her, but now everything had changed. People saw her as more than just a lonely old woman. She had become a symbol of fortitude and courage. "We just wanted to say thank you," the middle-aged woman said, holding out a basket of homemade cookies. "For what you and your dog have done. You gave us hope. We knew this place was dangerous, but you showed us that it could be fought." Martha stood at the threshold, slightly embarrassed by the attention that had suddenly descended on her. She petted Raina, who was sitting next to her. The dog seemed to understand what was happening. Her eyes remained calm, but wary. She was still a protector, ready for a new threat. "It wasn't me," Martha replied modestly. "It was Raina. I didn't even know she could do this. She saved me. She, saved us." Later that evening, on the other side of town, the remaining gang members were hiding in a dark room, trying to heal their wounds and hide from view. Their faces were pale, and the fear still red in their eyes. "We'll never go back there," the foremost of them said, clutching his bandaged hand. His voice trembled. "That place is not for us now. That dog, he's more than that. Their defeat was a lesson in justice, which was embodied not by man, but by the animal. For the neighborhood, it was a new stage, a stage where fear was finally replaced by hope, and darkness receded before light. Martha and Raina became more than just residents. They became legends. It had been weeks since that ill-fated night, but its echoes continued to echo through the neighborhood. An event that began with injustice and hatred was now a turning point for the community. People who had previously lived in fear began to feel more confident. Every time someone told the story of Martha and her faithful Raina, it sounded like a legend inspiring change. For Martha, life had changed. She was no longer the inconspicuous old woman who existed quietly in her corner of the world. She was now seen as a symbol of strength and resilience. Neighbors who used to turn away now drop by to visit, bring food, offer help. Their gazes, once filled with indifference, were now full of respect. But the real heart of the story remained Raina. Her presence inspired confidence not only in Martha, but in the entire neighborhood. Neighbors began to call her the angel dog or guardian of the neighborhood. Even the children who had been afraid of her at first now looked at her with admiration, and the bravest came up to pet her. Raina responded with calm but attentive affection, remaining a loyal protector. Martha sat on the porch of her house one evening, holding a cup of hot tea. She watched the sun sink slowly below the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the streets. Raina lay at her feet, napping quietly, but her ears twitched occasionally, picking up the slightest sounds. Martha turned to her. "You don't even realize what a difference you've made, girl. You've given me and these people something they lost a long time ago. Faith." Raina did not answer, but raised her head and looked at her mistress, her eyes glowing with the understanding that Martha had always found in her. "I used to think that nothing could be changed, that hate was forever," Martha continued. "But you've shown me that even the simplest of actions can change the world. All it takes is a little courage and loyalty." This story was a lesson to all who heard it. It reminded us that hate is a disease that feeds on fear and indifference. But it can be defeated by acting with faith, determination, and kindness. People began to realize that silence makes them complicit in injustice, and even the smallest actions can change the course of events. Many things have become different in the neighborhood. Those who used to feel unpunished realized that their power was illusory. The hatred they thought was their strength turned into weakness. They left, and there were no more rumors of their return. Those who remained began to work together to make the neighborhood safe for all. Martha and Raina have been part of this change. They inspired people to fight for their rights, protect the weak, and speak out against injustice. People began to come together to help each other, to be stronger together. A local journalist once wrote an article about this story. He called it "The Dog Who Brought Hope Back." In the article, he wrote, "This is not just a story about a dog who protected his mistress. It's a story about how faith and loyalty can overcome evil. Raina is not just a protector. She is a symbol that justice is alive even when all seems lost." The article spread far beyond the neighborhood. People from all over the city began sending letters to Martha, admiring her strength and thanking her for her example. For Martha and Raina, life was back to normal. But now it was a life filled with new meanings. When Martha looked at her dog, she saw more than just a loyal friend. She saw a reminder that good will always find a way to win. And though Raina did not speak human language, her actions were louder than any words. She showed that even in the darkest times there is light, that loyalty and love can turn fear into strength and hate into nothing. It was a lesson for all who saw or heard the story. And now, in this neighborhood, whenever someone felt weak, he remembered Raina, and realized that strength was not in size, not in volume, but in the courage to be true to what was right. Life in the neighborhood continued to go on as usual, but something subtly changed. Where once there had been silence and fear, there was energy. The energy of people who no longer wanted to be silent. Martha and Raina's story left a deep mark not only on the hearts of those who witnessed the events, but also on the culture of the neighborhood itself. Many people began to realize that change starts with simple actions. Some, inspired by the bravery of Martha and her dog, formed an action group to advocate for the rights of residents. They began patrolling the streets, helping the elderly, and holding meetings to hear everyone. People who used to be afraid to even talk to each other now began to communicate and support each other. If Martha could fight back, why can't we? They said at the meetings. We have a duty to protect not only ourselves, but also those who cannot stand up for themselves. But the most inspiring example for everyone was Raina. Her image became a symbol that strength lies not in hatred, but in the courage to protect those you love. One day, a local artist painted graffiti on the wall of an abandoned warehouse where the battle took place. The drawing depicted Raina in bright colors, standing proudly with an attentive gaze, as if ready to throw herself back into the fight for justice. Beneath the drawing were the words, "Here loyalty lives. Here justice lives." In the meantime, Marta noticed more and more how differently she was being treated. When she went for a walk with Raina, she was greeted with smiles. People who had previously avoided her gaze now raised their hands in greeting. She was no longer alone. One day, while walking past the grocery store, Martha noticed a young girl stop next to her. "That's your dog, isn't it?" she asked, looking at Raina with delight. "Yes, mine," Martha answered proudly. "I want to thank you," the girl continued. "You and your dog. You've shown me that I can't be silent. If it wasn't for you, I would have continued to be afraid. But now, I've learned that I need to protect myself." Martha smiled. It warmed her heart to know that her story, her struggle, mattered. She put her hand on Raina's head, and the dog, as if sensing that she was being spoken for, raised her head proudly. Despite these changes, however, Martha knew that the world was still not perfect. She saw youths like the ones who had attacked her still roaming the streets, full of anger and aggression. Those boys reminded her that hate doesn't go away on its own. It lives on as long as it is fed with fear, indifference, and indifference. But Martha was no longer the kind of woman who endured in silence. She decided that her mission was not only to live, but also to help people learn to live differently. She began visiting local schools, telling the children about the importance of being kind, fair, and brave. Every time she visited, Raina was there for her. The children, who at first were afraid of the huge dog, soon began to reach out and pet her, and the bravest ones hugged her around the neck. "Look at her," Martha said, pointing at Raina. "She's strong, but she doesn't use her power to hurt. She's protective, and you must be the same. Your strength must be in kindness and justice." These meetings became popular, and soon Martha and Raina became real heroes of the neighborhood. People started inviting them to different events to hear their story, and every time Martha would say, "It wasn't my victory, it was our victory. We can all be strong if we support each other." One morning, as Martha and Raina were walking down the street, they were approached by a group of young men. Martha was wary at first, remembering that terrible evening, but these guys looked different. Their faces were serious and their eyes showed remorse. "Forgive us, miss," one of them said, lowering his gaze. "We were part of the gang that attacked you. But after what happened, we realized a lot of things. You've changed us. We don't want to be like that anymore." Martha looked at them in silence. She felt that their words were sincere. Instead of anger, she felt something else, a slight but important hope. "If you want to make a difference, start with yourself," she said quietly. "Help others, and let your life be proof that change is possible." Years passed, but the story of Martha and Raina lived on. People passed it on by word of mouth, like a legend of how courage and loyalty can defeat evil. Raina lived a long life, staying by Martha's side until the end. And when she passed away, a memorial plaque with her name and the words, "She taught us what justice is." Martha lived a few more years, continuing to work to change her community. When she was gone, people said she left with a sense of accomplishment. Her home became a place where people came for inspiration, and her name was heard in every story of fortitude and love. Martha and Raina's story became a lesson for everyone about how important it is to fight hatred, not to lose faith in goodness, and to remember that even one dog and one person can change the world. Friends, this story is a reminder of how important it is to stand up to hate and injustice, even if it seems like you are alone. We hope it has stirred your emotions and perhaps reminded you of something personal. If you have experienced racism or injustice, we would love for you to share your stories in the comments. Your thoughts and revelations are very important to us. Each of your comments helps us better understand how such topics are meaningful to all of us. We incredibly appreciate each and every one of you who watch our videos, share your opinions, and support us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give us a like. It helps us create more stories like this that inspire and educate. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a wonderful day filled with kindness and justice.